Welcome to the Officio Spotlight podcast. My name is Simon Lipscomb and thank you very much for listening. Today, I'm very excited to say that my guest is Aris Georgopoulos. Aris is the Assistant Professor in Public Law and European Law at the University of Nottingham, as well as the Head of Innovation, AI, Strategic and Defence Procurement Research Unit of the Public Procurement Research Group. He's also co-lead of the Research Unit of Public Procurement, Human Rights and Social Sustainability. So Aris, thank you so much for joining me today for this conversation. Obviously, given your background, which we covered there are loads of areas it would be fascinating to discuss with you. But at the moment when we get emails and responses from listeners about things they want to cover on the podcast, the thing that's always at the top at the moment is AI, and particularly AI in the context of our world of procurement and supply chain. And I know that's an area you look at a lot, so delighted to have an expert to discuss that. To start, Aris, obviously, I'm sure people listening to this podcast will have certainly heard the term AI a lot. I'm sure they've heard many references to organizations and products like ChatGPT. But maybe we could start with, as much as you can on a topic this broad, but a little bit of baselining about AI and the technologies that we're talking about, and why is it such a prevalent topic in the press in everywhere you look at the moment?
I can hardly think of an area where AI doesn't appear now in the discussion. Artificial intelligence is something that potentially could change the world as we know it. Perhaps not tomorrow, but it has the potential of really altering the way that we see things, the way that we work, and the way that we live our lives. The potential is huge, really. Basically, what this new technology can do and what it does better every second that passes is to organize and collate information for big data sets, some of which are publicly available, data sets that up until recently would not communicate or speak with each other, and it can find a lot of information, create new connections, and lead to solutions that previously you would have different processes that were required. So it's the ultimate streamlining tool for achieving results from, finding or optimizing your schedule, but also increasingly to carry out much more complicated things. And as I said before, the important thing is that it gets cleverer by the second, and it can take into account billions of parameters, and so it's very, very advanced.
We're talking about a technology that's huge potential implications, but advancing exponentially in terms of its abilities and applications.
Precisely.
As you know, largely the listenership for this podcast is procurement and supply chain professionals. Mm-hmm. Do you have any perspectives on perhaps some ideas of either realistic short-term use case scenarios of AI in that world, or even potentially medium to longer-term uses?
Absolutely. So this year, I'm researching this area of applications of AI in public governance, and I have a particular focus on public procurement and health procurement. Even more specifically. Why? Because obviously we have the experience from COVID and the procurement during the COVID period, where we had an unprecedented spike in demand throughout the world. Demand that disrupted beyond recognition established supply chains throughout the world. And we all remember the challenges that we faced from a procurement and health provision point of view. Now, the experience in the UK, but the UK was not alone. You remember that at some point it was very difficult to find substitutes for this disruption. Fundamentally, one of the issues that led to where we are is that we had, when the disruption occurred, then a lot of the buyers looked at trying to identifying alternative solutions. Sometimes these alternative solutions will come from companies or players that they were not participating in the markets of the production, for example, of gowns or gloves, but could do that because there was a huge opportunity, higher prices, and so on and so forth. But then the question is, who do you call, right? What's the phone number to call? And of course, that phone number would normally be provided by some middle person, a middle company that would charge an arm and a leg for providing that number, sometimes just a number, or an email. Now, AI, some of the potential uses, and this is one of the areas that we are looking together with a startup with whom collaborating under the auspices of an innovation fellowship of the British Academy, is to see, for example, how artificial intelligence and machine learning technologies could, for example, optimize or create a better image of how the market is at a specific point in time for specific products, right? And how it could look like, especially when we have disruptions of that type. In other words, it could, one of the possible, if you want, uses and added value of this technology would be to essentially have a number without having to follow the middle person and of course avoid all these intermediate huge charges. So it's, if I can use this term, I don't know if it would democratize a little bit more this horizon scanning for this type of situations. But of course this is not just an optimization that could occur these specific difficult times. It could occur, I would argue, under normal circumstances where for example a procurement authority would like to really see what alternatives exist, not in the existing players in a market, but perhaps potential new entrants that could reinvigorate competition, for example. And arguably, with more competition, you have more choice. And if you have more choice, you have higher probability of achieving value for money. So that's a good thing. As I said, there are already existing solutions and algorithms that they are providing that. And of course, these algorithms, they are constantly being improved, fine-tuned, because we're in the process of having a reformed public procurement regime in the UK. With post-Brexit regime that, of course, was recently, we have the new act that has been enacted, but of course, the new act will be followed by statutory instruments, secondary legislation that will give flesh to the bones of the act. Fine-tuning algorithms with the new policy directions, the new legal constraints or legal parameters would be very, very important. And this is the type of collaboration I am having with the technology world in this context. But even before the advent of ChatGPT, artificial intelligence solutions existed. And there was a very interesting, I think it was from 2020, a McKinsey report, where you have the procurement process from start to finish. So from the source to contract, and then the post-contract phase, the awards, the management of the project, where it identified the existing level of technology, and that's already 2 years ago. So in other words, the specific percentages have changed. It looked at what existing technology could provide in terms of optimizing the specific processes in procurement. And there was, for example, at the level of payment processing and payment management, 69% of the process could be automated using technologies or solutions based on machine learning and artificial intelligence.
Right.
And at that time, only 31% of the processes based on the existing technologies, even though there wasn't any specific off-the-shelf solution, the technology was at sufficient level to develop ad hoc solutions for this remaining 31%. There are other parts of the process where technology at the time of the survey had less existing off-the-shelf solutions, but the technology again could be developed. And there were some at the higher echelon of, if you want, the percentage where the actual technology could not serve for substituting some of the, if you want, manual processes. But that's, as I said, that was the world 3 years ago. We are at a completely different stage now. And this is, I think, the important element for the discussion about AI. I think the percentages have shrunk as time goes by. And by time, I do not mean years. We are talking about months. The technological solutions could be much greater in this area throughout the procurement process.
This technology, as we said at the start, growing exponentially. To your point, a couple of years ago, covered so much, probably massively further forward now. Roll that forward month by month, that's continuing. And you talked about the technology's given a level of visibility and a pace to things like the COVID supply, understanding supply chains is just unthought of before. Obviously, all of that presents enormous opportunities for efficiencies. Does it present risks to organizations, to governments in terms of the management of that potential?
Absolutely. So looking at the micro level, right? So of the specific applications on administrative processes, One of the risks that is embedded in the companies that try to find ways of avoiding is the potential inherent bias in the data sets that AI form, if you want, the source for the artificial intelligence to take a specific decision or reach a specific result. So there are issues about embedded biases in the data sets that AI brings together, or sometimes in the parameters that we put as, if you want, the controllers of AI for the moment, the process. So it's the inherent bias.
Again, just try and put that a little bit in context of procurement. So you talked a little, I guess we would both agree one of the things about procurement as a topic is transparency. That's something,
Absolutely,
both parties look for in a procurement process. And you were talking about the idea of AI technologies being applied to procurement processes. Is there an implication there around transparency in the sense that if a decision is taken I have no concept of how complicated ChatGPT is, but I'm assuming the enormously complicated series of things that lead to decisions. Is there an issue about that becoming almost impossible to audit, right? How these solutions are coming to conclusions and how you can demonstrate they are fair and transparent, even in the narrow world of procurement, right?
That could be one of the risks. And then the question is, how do you mitigate that risk? A natural response would be, for example, to allow full access to the code, to understand exactly how it works and what parameters it takes into account and what type of data are used. However, even that mitigation measure may carry its own risks. For example, as you know, that if a lot of absolute transparency takes place in the context of public procurement, for example, absolute transparency with regards to pricing, yes, or supply chain, the supply chain that leads to specific pricing solution by different bidders, that could open the Pandora's box for collusion, right?
Right.
So there are competition implications or risks that need to be fine-tuned. And this is another aspect of, if you want, the consideration that one has to take into account when this algorithm is being developed for the use in the context of procurement. How much information, transparency you want. But of course, it doesn't have to be the transparency at the level of individual companies that X bids Y. But for example, you could see trends in a specific market that could provide useful information. Let's say that we're talking about a market, a procurement market, where because there are high entry barriers, it's difficult for new entrants to come in, be it because of regulatory barriers or be it because of the structure of the markets, significant or high sunk costs. If one sees a specific direction of how that market works as a result of procurement decisions, that could also provide useful information that could open the door for potential collusive practices. So this is why I mentioned that we try to fix one thing or optimize one side, and then there are risks that appear not necessarily in the field of procurement, but in neighboring areas, like competition law.
Yeah. So Aris, if I was a listener to this working in procurement and supply chain, there is this change coming. Clearly, I think everyone accepts this isn't going to stop. What would you recommend that professionals are doing to understand this area, to kind of be prepared to be aware of it?
So there are various things that one can do in order to, first of all, be aware of the changing environment, because that changing environment it affects and will affect even more so the workforce. Okay, so it is important for procurement officers, among the various other challenges and objectives for improving their game, it's to be more literate in these developments. As I said before, there are solutions that they are off the shelf, and there are some others that can be ad hoc developed. It is important to be aware of the risks, the efficiencies that they can bring, but also that the risk that they can carry. And having a conversation with their legal teams and finance teams that also they have to up their game in this regard, I think would be a very prudent course of action. I assume that there may be some resistance in incorporating quickly all these decisions, or perhaps try to focus on specific parts of the process as opposed to changing the process altogether. I open up a small parenthesis here. I read an article and I posted on my website. I wrote a piece about a project in China. And let us assume that what has been reported it's absolutely correct, right? And of course, we may question that. But apparently, that project was about the creation of a water dam. The whole process from start to finish was based on artificial intelligence and robotics. The human input in the process was absolutely minimal. Now, I'm not saying that tomorrow we will have something like that here, assuming that that was actually the case in China. But I believe that the right way of going about would be to try to test which part of the process could be optimized with limited risks for the process and for the wider ecosystem of procurement. And then, of course, revisit that assessment as technology develops.
So, Aris, one of the other questions I had is AI and the application of AI in procurement tools a positive opportunity for SMEs, or is there a risk to them?
Again, one could contemplate both positives and more challenges. For example, a better horizon scanning, arguably, of an actual or potential markets means that SMEs might have a better visibility from the point of view of the buyer. They could come under buyer's radar, and especially if the buyer is keen to shake a little bit the market or shake, for example, nudge the incumbent, which normally is a larger company, by having more newcomers, SMEs in the game. That could be beneficial both for the SMEs because they will get this exposure and visibility by the system, but also for the procurement process as a whole, and competition and value for money. However, the downside is that with the use of artificial intelligence solutions, it is possibly the larger players would be in a position to understand, learn the system faster than the SMEs. And perhaps as a result of that, we may see that in the new system, the larger players being able to understand how the system works better and then place themselves now in a process that it's, let's say, it's more automatic, or it follows an automation to again perpetuate their incumbent status. So it's a mixed bag, and this is why it is important, as we said before, to check and educate oneself, and that includes the SMEs and all those participating in the procurement process, as to what the new technologies can offer and what risks they may carry.
My final question, Aris, this is a fascinating topic. I feel like we've literally just scratched the surface clearly in a short podcast. We talked about risks, we talked about opportunities. Where do you sit? You can open a paper and read doomsday scenarios about AI and its implications. You can read stuff about the exciting opportunity. Like, you're an expert in the space. Where do you sit on that seesaw at this point in time?
I'm not a doomer.
Okay.
I see the potential. This is why I want to make the distinction between the macro level.
Yep.
And yes, absolutely. I think there is a risk at some point, but I don't know, and I don't have the tools really to, and I don't think anyone does, even the experts, even those who invested or devised these technologies we're talking about, they can predict how fast we will reach that, the so-called singularity point, the Rubicon point, after which we will not be able, or the humankind will not be able to control this, right? In the meantime, I think the emphasis should be given to the specific applications that they are available, and try to identify ways of mitigating the actual risks that are posed, not existential risk, but, for example, as I mentioned, risks about competition, intellectual property, very, very important elements. Perhaps not necessarily the level of, if you want, the procurement side of things, although one, for example, could contemplate situations where the actual bid itself is subject to, or is based on, elements that where question marks about the intellectual property are raised, right? So if you have, especially in innovation procurement, which is a very, very interesting and dear topic that I'm following very, very closely, how much of an idea we could say belongs to the various small parts of the data sets that led to its creation. There is a very, very lively debate, especially amongst my colleagues that deal with intellectual property, how best, because everything happens in nanoseconds.
Yes.
It's very difficult to identify where the information comes from, But we know that it happens, and it has a significant, very, very important impact on existing intellectual property rights. So we have to rethink a lot of the fundamental elements and first principles, really, about key parts of law, like intellectual property, like competition law. And I don't see why public procurement will remain unaffected. Some of the key fundamentals of at least the legal treatment of the process.
Yeah. Aris, as I say, fascinating conversation. There's so much more we should cover maybe in a future podcast, but thank you for taking the time to give us that perspective on AI. It was really, really interesting.
Thank you, Simon.
Thanks for listening to today's episode. If you've enjoyed this podcast, please give us a click on the follow button on your chosen podcast platform. We'd also love to hear your views on either future topics or indeed if you've got any thoughts on future guests that we should look to get onto the podcast. Thanks again. See you next time.